thank you for rejoining us after the lunch break. I know there's some people still coming in. We've got almost a full house here, which is great to see. Now, this is our first panel discussion of the day, here on this stage at least, and we're going to be talking about, you guessed it, Scope 3, but also we're going to be leaning heavily towards ESG as well. So, the topic of this panel is Scope 3 and ESG. It's all our problem, question mark. With new buying patterns from ever more socially conscious consumers and customers, there's been a greater drive towards more ethical, sociable and sustainable practices within businesses. Customers want transparency, and more than ever, they want to know that their spending is not having a negative impact on the world around them. Part of this, of course, lies in ensuring fair wages, humane working conditions and low emissions during the manufacturing and transporting of goods globally. However, supply chains are not closed systems, so how do businesses control how their partners operate, and is it even their responsibility to do so? And that's obviously where we come into the whole Scope 3. Now, to discuss this issue, we have 4 experts with me here on stage. We have Liz Houston, is a member of the MSCI ESG and climate research team, focusing on retail and luxury. Her research looks at the environmental and social risks facing these industries and the performance of the companies within them. Sam Jackson has a varied background in operations, sustainability, policy and governance. In his early career, he worked primarily in the charity and tourism sectors before moving permanently into climate and sustainability. And nowadays, Sam manages the climate impact team at Ecologi, helping to find and support impactful climate projects and empowering businesses to take steps towards sustainability. Next up, we have Maureen Bray, who has worked in the fields of sustainability management and consultancy for over a decade. She currently leads the European strategy business for 3 Degrees, assisting clients towards their climate and sustainability goals. And Clare Lissaman and her team help businesses to deploy positive practices across their supply chains, working together to fight the global inequalities that push people into poverty. They work with companies in practical ways to make supply chains more resilient and sustainable, harnessing Oxfam's expertise, experience and global network to improve lives for workers and producers. So, a full house, and what a brilliant panel to discuss Scope 3 and ESG. So please, your panel. Okay, now we're going to dive in here, but we're going to have a bit of a pause sort of halfway through the session. If anyone has any questions, you know what to do. Stick your hand up and we'll get a stick microphone over to you and try and take as many questions as we can from the audience here and to the virtual audience who are joining us from around the world as well. Okay, so the big question, and I don't know who wants to answer this or whether this is just a discussion, who is actually responsible for governing Scope 3 and other ESG practices? Should there be a certification that suppliers can buy into, allowing businesses to meet their ESG standards? This could take up the whole session, this question, couldn't it?
You're going to throw it too.
Sam?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very, very large question to start us off. I think that something that I think will resonate with, I think, a lot of people in the room and people on the panel is that a lot of this is, there's a lot of unknowns with regards to ESG for a lot of businesses out there, and so that kind of clarity that some kind of certification or those kind of things would bring would be very welcome. Whether, I think, certification, whether that comes down from policy or whether it comes from sort of industry groups coming together for best practice or those kind of things, I'm not sure. I'm probably not the best qualified person on the panel to put forward a response on that front, but I think it is really, really crucial. I think that there's definitely a huge amount of ambiguity, a huge amount of uncertainty in a lot of businesses. You may have heard my colleague Krista earlier on in her keynote saying this, but a lot of the research we've done shows that a lot of businesses have an awful lot of intention to work towards these goals, whether it be the E, the S, or the G of ESG, but they just don't know where to begin, basically. And something along those lines, I'm sure, would be very helpful to them. Yeah.
Now, Claire, I saw you nodding your head there during Sam's answer. Do you want to chip in?
I can. I mean, in one sense, I'm a huge fan of certification or setting a standard and then having someone independently look at it as a framework or tool to help businesses work through issues. Yeah, I would say, and Oxfam says that it's definitely not the whole answer, and we shouldn't expect or rely on certification. I'm going to firmly speak about the social part of ESG, as you might expect from Oxfam, to be able to give us the whole thing in improving human rights or having better equity or equality or gender equality in supply chains. So I think that use it as a tool, take it as far as it will go, don't 100% rely on it. And if we're talking about ESG, that's each aspect of that could be broken down into multiple certifications. Even in my world of social, in the fashion industry alone, we've just done a comparison for a client on, I think, 9 different social certifications alone. So having one thing that could cover all, maybe that's where regulation actually should operate rather than certification.
Liz, regulation or certification?
I think you could, the philosophical debate aside, the ever-marching onward step of regulators globally does seem to be in the direction of mandatory reporting. Certainly for larger businesses, it's not necessarily relevant at this stage for SMEs. But in the large corporate space, we see mandatory due diligence reporting on supply chains coming into the EU. There's mooted regulation coming out of New York in terms of fashion. There's, regulations coming in to enforce companies to be able to demonstrate the provenance of their goods before they're allowed to get over the US border. The regulation is either here or it's probably coming. So certification aside, you can't stop the regulation.
Maureen.
I think it's been well summarized, this mixture whereby we all take responsibility in some form or another. And there is a part for governments to play in setting those policies, and we are seeing that. And those linking to frameworks is important as well to give that kind of direction. I think first and foremost, though, organizations or those who are looking to work with their supply chains, they shouldn't really get bogged down with the detail or looking for a standard to be set before they do anything about it. I think that there needs to be, some proactivity there.
Okay, so Maureen, staying on that point then, so what measures can a business take to reduce or offset that carbon footprint of third-party suppliers? So
there's quite a few different steps that organizations can take. I think the first one is measuring, so understanding, what are you targeting and where are you starting from? So the first part is understanding your supply chain. The next one is working with suppliers, so education, engaging with them, understanding what do they have in place and where could they improve and how can you help them and support them in that. Next to education is, value chain intervention. So if you don't have complete transparency or direct traceability, you can work on a supply shed. So you can work with, a supply shed area to look to improve and reduce emission factors associated with that area. Next, there could be carbon insetting. So you can work with your supply chain in, funding improvements directly within a supply chain. So there's carbon insetting. And then lastly, there's also, direct action that you can be undertaking. So for instance, we often have organizations coming to us and asking, how do we buy certificates, energy attribute certificates, GOs, RECs, whichever region we're talking about. How can we actually buy for our supply chain so that we can at least make up for what they're not covering in terms of renewables, for example?
Okay, Sam, I'm going to stick on Scope 3 here as well. Would you say it's the responsibility of companies in developed countries to offset the environmental impact of their suppliers operating in developing countries?
I'm going to split that question into two. I'm going to tackle the word offset specifically second, I think. Absolutely, I think it is, as Maureen summarised, I think that it is definitely the responsibility of the organisations in the developed world to engage with their suppliers and take a kind of active role in the accounting for the emissions that form part of their value chain. Absolutely, I do think that. And that, there's various reasons for that. On a kind of really macro level, we understand that the activities of the developed world and the rich world in general are largely responsible for the climate change that we're seeing now. We're aware that, developing countries are going to be disproportionately hit by the impacts thereof. We know that. And there's also kind of more micro-level disparities. There's a data gap, for example. It's a lot easier to understand and get hold of valuable data, in the setting that we're in now than it is in, some parts of the world. There's various kind of factors that contribute to a responsibility to take an active role there, definitely. Offsetting, I think, just jumping on the word offset specifically, I think yes, I think that's also fair to say, but I don't think anybody that takes climate change seriously thinks that offsetting is the first step in the journey. It absolutely isn't, and so that's where that engagement comes in. And as Maureen says, starting that journey, committing to taking, getting to grips with your value chain, and thinking about obviously your scopes 1 and 2, which you're probably going to have to report, and then going into scope 3 with an open mind and going, how am I going to engage with my suppliers? How am I going to find out where the emissions are coming from? And then taking the responsibility and the accountability to tackle it is crucial, I think. And working with your suppliers obviously forms a large part of that. And the reason for that, I think, that responsibility is largely because, whatever your business is doing and whoever your suppliers are, they're a core component of your success. You're relying on them, and the relationship you have with them is like that. And to that extent, you should, absolutely take accountability and as far as you can, engage on that front.
Now, it can be difficult, can't it? Because if you're a large organisation as well, you could be talking about tens of thousands of suppliers. And so having that visibility into scope 3 is almost an impossible task. Liz, when it comes around to looking at transparency or enforcing transparency in third-party supply chains, how can we enforce it, and is this our responsibility to do so?
I think a lot of the answer to this question will depend on what kind of business you are and where you are in that supply chain. So there will obviously be exceptions to this rule, but in general, you would say that the person that hands over the cash is the one that gets to call the shots on how the business is done. So if you would like to see traceability in your supply chain, transparency in your supply chain, then you can ask for that as a condition of doing business. Now, the issue is that might be disruptive in terms of change. It might take extra time. You might be going against the flow of how business is traditionally done in your industry, but it is doable. You are the customer. You can request this. And yes, is it our responsibility? As I said, the moral questions aside, you're going to have to report on this. It has to be part of what the discussion that companies are having with regulators. And then from just a business perspective as well, kind of following on from what Sam said, it's a core operational risk, understanding the nature of your supply chain. So you have to know where your goods are being made in order to know which markets you can ship them to, and you have to know where your raw materials are coming from. And as we go forward and we see increasing impacts of climate change, knowing where your raw materials come from and how sustainable that supply source is a key operational risk that businesses should be looking at, whether they are, good people at heart or not.
Could I add to that, actually?
Of course.
Yeah. I think you're completely right. I think one of the things as well, very similarly to the increased kind of regulation and legislative burden of some of this, is the commercial side. The audience that you're selling your product to or your service to is not going to become less aware of what's going on, and they're not going to be less interested over time in where you're getting your materials from or who your suppliers are. They're only ever going to be more interested. There's only ever going to be more interest and more of a commercial pressure, isn't there, to do that. So yeah, I completely second what Liz is just saying. I think it makes sense for any business now to be thinking about this and implementing, if not already, because it's only going to get more important over time.
That's interesting. I mean, you talked there about like commercial considerations. I'd be interested to get your view on this, Claire. Should cost ever be a factor in sourcing an ethical and sustainable supply chain?
I mean, interesting question. I guess it's a factor whether it should be or not is probably the answer to that it can't not be a factor, and where cost sits and how it's shared. And I mean, from an Oxfam perspective, we talk about how value is shared more equitably and look at it from the other perspective. I was interested when you talked there about you hold the power effectively, and where power is held in supply chains, and he or she who pays the money calls the tune. But going back to Mark, so I'm slightly sidetracking from your question here, you've got labour capital as well as financial capital, and that adds into that power. So, I mean, cost is a factor. I think the question is how you then look at it and how you look at the things that are not costed in the way we think about cost. So if you can only make a profit because you've got horrendous scope 2 and scope 3 emissions and your workers somewhere in your supply chain don't get paid enough to live on, then the cost of your product is being subsidised by the poor and by the planet. And it's thinking about and remodelling and thinking about things like that, which people have been doing for a while in a quite a different way. And I guess that's where some of that transparency starts coming in as well. So I'm flinging some answers at you there.
No, that's all good.
So yes, it is, and no, it isn't. But what do we mean by cost is probably the answer.
Well, anyone in the audience want to chip in here while we're talking about cost?
Can I answer one other thing?
Yeah,
which is probably me rather than Oxfam, I should say, because we don't campaign on this specifically. But we often talk about, customers won't bear the cost of it. And things like CEO pay, which are being talked about, and shareholder value and finance, they never really get properly considered, I think, when you're at the buyer is talking to the supplier stage of costing. And going, where else could we find, forget those other things I talked about, where else could we actually even find the cash from? Those aspects of equality probably need to be talked about a lot more than we are in these kind of conversations. Sorry, back to the audience, but that was my other one.
Sorry to interrupt audience again.
Let's go on.
And I mean, my follow-up on that would be, particularly if you're looking at something like a piece of clothing, which obviously you will be talking about very frequently, per pound of cost relating to that clothing for a retailer, the vast majority of it is markdown cost. So the cost of paying, and I know Oxfam's done research on this, the cost of making sure that your garment workers are being paid a living wage is pennies. And the cost of having to mark down your goods because no one wants to buy them is huge. And there is the opportunity for businesses to be able to have a rethink about how they structure their industry. But this is where I come down to the point on cost again. It's not the cost of doing business well that's expensive. It's making the change to getting from where you are to where you need to be that is expensive in terms of time and effort.
But it's essential that businesses do that.
I think it's likely, coming back to our previous points on regulation and on consumer demand, essential is a strong word, but you can make a case that there's a competitive advantage for doing so.
Okay, good answer. Right, if you just start by stating your name and where you're from, please.
Yes, it's David Harmon from AMCL. I'd like to challenge the panel, actually, is that when you use the term cost, you are immediately talking about financial cost. And I think the challenge that we all have with sustainability is using the same units for all the 6 capitals. I think whoever comes up with that answer is going to solve a lot of our problems.
Anybody want to comment on that?
Well, I think that kind of comes back to what Claire was saying as well, about a lot of industry relying on externalizing costs. It's kind of, I think that's kind of the same point.
Okay, so Maureen, what are the options for companies out there who want to take a stronger stance on Scope 3? How can they go about that?
So we already went through some of the measures, that they could be undertaking to address Scope 3. But if an organization wanted to take a bigger stance, there's more to do around collaboration and tackling ecosystems. And what I mean by that is working with peers and competitors and industry bodies to be able to drive change within the supply chain. So collectively, so we talked about, and I don't know if it was one of the conversations we had prior to coming out here as panelists, or whether it was one of the previous sessions that I sat in on, but we often talk about the buying power and being able to influence, and when a group collectively gets together and tries to tackle that issue, then they have better chances of that. Similarly, when we look at policy and we talk about regulation, lobbying for change and lobbying for regulation that level sets and kind of again increases chances for impact and having that transparency and driving reduction down. And finally, it's about taking the time and putting investment in. So for example, we often get questions from organizations who are looking to tackle their supply chain issues or to tackle their scope 3 specifically, and to kind of introduce change. And what we often end up seeing is that they'll fund those initiatives rather than putting the burden or the action on the individual suppliers. It's about actually, how can we fund this activity for you to better support? And I suppose that goes back to the developing country and suppliers that are not based within country. How can we actually fund externally and support other geographies? So how can we support the advancement of renewables, for example, in countries where that isn't currently available or is not growing as significantly as quickly?
Okay, I'm gonna start with Claire on this next one, but I think we'll probably go around the whole panel, because again, it's one of those questions or topics that we could do a full session or even a full day on. So I'm going to pick on you first, Claire. Do you have any advice for companies looking to build a more robust ESG strategy?
No, none at all.
No.
We don't have any thoughts on it as Oxfam. Yes, I do. And I'm going to firmly talk about advice around the social part of the ESG strategy. And I think, it depends where you sit. Sometimes I do feel when people talk about ESG, the S is slipping out the window a little bit. Not always, different forums and stuff, but I want to firmly bring it back here and talk about that social. I don't know how many of you know we had a Behind the Barcodes campaign that Oxfam's been running over the last few years, looking at the human rights impacts of supermarkets. And I took some of these advice about how you build the social aspect of strategy from the recommendations that we specifically give as part of that campaign, which is, there's five, I think. Start with your high-level commitments, board level, externally publishing, transparent. I'm loving the fact that we're all talking about, be transparent about this now, published, be public, talk about stuff. So that's our starting point for the strategy. Our approach to it, and this I think is different, and it's interesting when it comes to your point about some people having thousands of suppliers, is be worker-centric. Take participatory approaches, take a gender lens. So that very human-centered approach to it. And I think I've been doing this for 20-odd years now. And so much of the stuff businesses were looking at was how do we get data? And it's almost as if the people weren't really humans. They're things there, and we've got to manage and measure them and do stuff. And so trying to be worker-centric in your approach to your strategy, hearing the voice of workers through trade unions, it doesn't have to be individual, is really important in the approach. And then it's your three things. Know and show risks. So do your human rights due diligence, risk assessments, do your human rights impact assessments or deep dives in your strategy. Be transparent. We add in commit to grievance mechanisms, because that's how you hear, one of the ways you hear the voices. Act in your own operations and your supply chain. Have a 3-year action plan. Act beyond your supply chain, so the stuff you were saying about join together with others, be participating in groups. And start measuring your impact, not just your activity. Don't know your commitments or your pledges, what's the actual impact, try and see what's happening. So high-level commitments, be worker-centric and participatory. Know and show your risks, act in your own operations and your supply chain, act beyond supply chain, and show impact. That was 6. I'm sure it was only 5 in my head. There you go. I'm sorry if I took up too much time on that.
Not at all. Let's go round again. So Maureen, do you want to add to that at all? What advice would you give in terms of a robust ESG strategy?
I would say, so let's go back to not getting bogged down by standards. Starting with the measurement and the transparency, and ultimately taking action and having an eye on the impacts. I think that those are, I know that I've summarized some of those, but I would call those as probably the ones that kind of stand out the most for me.
Sam?
Yeah, it was quite hard to follow such a comprehensive summary.
It's possible I gave this some thought in advance.
Sure. I think a couple of things stick out to me. One, going back to what we were talking about at the beginning with regards to, making that commitment, making that first commitment, is try not to think that you're trying to do all of this at once. There's no magic button that you can press and suddenly you've got a net zero plan or a full ESG strategy, and you've got amazing supplier engagement and all this kind of stuff. That doesn't exist. That's not a reality. So picture it as a continual journey, and use that to empower you. Use that to inspire you to not freeze in the headlights of going, oh my goodness, we've got so much to do, or so many suppliers to get through, or whatever. And second, sort of related to that, secondly, is the idea of, there's going to be missteps you make, I'm sure. There's going to be things where you misreport something, or you find something out that you weren't expecting, or you have a breakdown in communications with a particular supplier, whatever. Just, be accountable, be transparent, be honest, have that kind of in the back of your mind as you go through it, and approach it with the perspective of continual improvement. This is an iterative process. It's a journey that every business is probably going to have to go on, and it's not possible to go from 0 to 1 in a day. It's not. So don't worry, don't get in your head about that. Just committing and starting and getting on exactly the journey that Claire's just described, I think is crucial, and it's not going to be achieved all at once.
Liz first. Anything to add there?
I don't know. Let's let Claire nip in.
No, it's
and
only
then
really
I'll do mine.
quickly, just to reinforce. I was speaking to a client the other day who said, look, Claire, so they're doing a whole new thing, global company. We need to crawl before we can walk, before we can run.
100%.
So that was all. I was just going to
100%.
reinforce it. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I have a very, what may be infuriatingly so for a lot of the audience, very investor-focused viewpoint on ESG. And for most of the time when we're having this discussion, we're talking about E and S. So G, which is governance, is very much a separate topic. So from an E and S perspective, I think what businesses should be doing is understanding where the environmental and social operational risks are in their businesses. I think companies often underestimate the impact that something like the contentment of their workforce can have on their operations, on their output, on their relationship with customers. So there's all kinds of research that says things like, if you do a worker engagement survey and your workers are happy, you will outperform the stock market. Like just like basic stuff like that quite often gets ignored. So my advice to companies would be, don't try and save the world with your actions. Start by looking at what your business risks are, maybe then broaden it out to, I want to reduce my overall impact. But purely ESG, drive it from your operations.
Okay, that seems like a good point to turn back to the audience again. We've got a question down here.
Like when people are keen.
Yeah, someone's very keen.
Only because I had a hand up earlier. Hi, I'm Rebecca Goosen. I work for Schroders, so very interested in your thoughts. My question is, to what extent do the panel think that current inflationary pressures, economic climate, and all the other things that are happening in the globe, energy crisis and so on, is going to impact the investment focus and maybe prioritisation of ESG everywhere?
The panel are queuing up for this one. Don't make me pick somebody. Who wants to answer this one?
Well, I think that we're already seeing that, right? The amount of focus at the moment in terms of funding that is going into, purposeful businesses and organizations that do no harm and that are positively looking to impact, the environment and social circumstances. I think we're seeing that, and I think we're just going to continue seeing the rest of that, divesting in companies that aren't sustainable and looking to focus on the positive impacts.
I mean, from an investor perspective, might seem a strange time to advocate selling your oil and gas assets, given oil prices. But from a corporate perspective, I mean, there's never been a better time to start thinking about reducing energy usage in your business and in your supply chains.
Can you speak into the microphone, please? Oh, sorry, I thought you just still had it. Sorry.
I suppose my thoughts were that actually, as companies start to struggle, because financially there are so many other pressures, it's going to go down the list of priorities, not up. Do you see what I mean? So at the moment, clearly it's the trendy, to be, thing to do, and clearly it's something we should do ethically and morally. But my concern is that actually the opposite's going to happen, because everybody's going to be worrying about, much more fundamental basic things.
I mean, I think if we were relying purely on voluntary corporate actions, then you might be right. But, and I have some sympathy with boards. They've been staggering from one crisis to the next for the past kind of 3 years or so, dealing with very short-term crisis management. But the regulation's not going away. So this is work that has to be done.
Any more questions? Yes, a few hands up. Thank you, Tom.
I guess just to kind of follow on from that, I work for the food service, so we've hit a triple threat of water, energy, and everything under the sun in terms of ESG and where it falls in the priority. Not that we don't want to do anything, but to go on the margin question again, on what as an industry is already very tight, how would you communicate that value then, especially when we are at the mercy of many clients who just want to cut their own costs as well? How do we communicate that this is worth their money when they're trying to tighten the purses?
I can start with that one, yeah. I think it's a really difficult one. It's a really difficult time for an awful lot of organisations in this particular space. And this question down here was, to what extent is it? Massively. Nobody's pretending that it isn't, I don't think. But I think it goes back to something that I think Liz was saying, is that the financially difficult bit is making the transition from where you are now to where the path that you want to be on. The longer term, this is on the financial side of things, the longer term outlook is much better on that path than the path that we're currently on. And again, we know this is documented very well. It's that initial kind of jump that's going to cause the biggest amount of pain, I think, in terms of costs, rearranging your operations and those kind of things. And it's completely true. It's a really, really difficult time for people. And as I started with earlier on as well, the impacts of climate change and of ecosystem breakdown and things like this are felt. It's very likely more strongly somewhere in your supply chain than they are here as well. So those considerations have to come into all of it, which is why I think, leading into what Claire was saying earlier on as well. I'm sure there are people on this panel that are more qualified than I am to kind of give an answer, to kind of say this is what you need to do. But I think, where the question is, how will this impact it? Obviously, yes, it will. If for no other reason, sidestepping the financial side of it, if for no other reason then people have got other things on their mind at the moment. And so we, as an industry, it's our responsibility to kind of go, well, this is a macro problem. These things are all interlinked. It's whether it be water or food or biodiversity or human rights, or all of those things are all interconnected as one part of a big problem that we're trying to solve. And so we can't lose sight of that, even though, of course, in the immediate term, it's extremely difficult for a lot of organisations.
Okay, I want to do a quick poll, actually, maybe just a show of hands. I think our previous question was alluding to the fact that maybe ESG and sustainability has slipped down the corporate agenda, if you like, with geopolitical uncertainty and inflation and everything else that's going on. So how many people feel that in the last, say, 2-3 years, that ESG and sustainability has moved down the agenda for corporates? Okay, so you don't feel, just for people who aren't in the room here, We have around, I would say, conservatively 250 people sitting in the room here. There was only one hand that said that ESG and sustainability has slipped down the corporate agenda, and I will ask you why in a moment. But everyone else feels that this is still the number one priority for organisations? No?
I'm not sure I'd argue
The
it's
question
number one.
wasn't number one.
Yeah, it's
Well,
not the
no, I
number
know.
one priority.
Devil's advocate, maybe, you know.
I've been surprised during the COVID years. I was fully, having been around for however long I've been doing this, thinking it was just a trend. Sustainability is just a trend. It's a marketing thing. That it seemed to be feeling it was getting embedded, and I was like, COVID, it's just going to get knocked out. It's definitely going to go down. And I really haven't seen, certainly in some of the sectors and some of the areas I'm working, I've been surprised by how much it didn't get knocked out. And I think some of that is regulation. Modern Slavery Act can't not do stuff on it. Some of it is the looking to regulation. Some of it's consumer, or feeling of consumers, some of it's investors, it's your classic sort of stakeholder mapping, but it's been and some of it I think it has actually got a bit more embedded, and people are just going, this is the cost of doing business, we need to be doing this. I think from our perspective it would be like, what are you actually doing? How good is it? Are you ticking boxes of ESG, or are you really delivering change? But that's the fact it's still on agendas after 3 years of really quite difficult times for most businesses, if not all. I think it's interesting. So.
Okay, shall we hear from the one dissenting voice in the room? Can we get
Not on the agenda of your business.
We'll get a microphone to that brave man. Just start by stating your name and where you're from, please.
David Loseby, Professor of Research Impact in Supply Chain Management at Leeds University Business School. You probably know my views, Scott. So I think it's purely based upon research and nothing else in terms of where ESG sits on the corporate priority list. I think what we have to recognise is it's still a top 5 priority for most corporates. But I think the reality in terms of basis points of where it sits in terms of that sort of priority, then it certainly has slipped down the leaderboard. And I think what we're seeing is really the fact that there are other immediate priorities that have a shorter term impact in terms of the organisation, given the fact that most ESG strategies and in fact plans and operationalisation of the whole sort of ESG strategy has a longer term to it, and there isn't the, I'll call it the immediacy and of benefits that we see coming out of things in an ESG plan, particularly when you start to think about most commitments to net zero, carbon neutral, etc., are somewhere between 2030 and 2050, depending on which organisation you look at. And therefore, there are other things that, how can I put it, are more immediate on the CEO's agenda. I'm quite happy to follow that up with a question then for the panel, if that's okay.
Does anybody disagree with David, by the way? Strongly disagree with him?
I'm quite happy to be challenged.
He'll be in the bar later. Just saying. Okay, all right, thank you for that, David.
I think
He had a question, yeah.
Oh, did you have a question?
I did have a question, yes.
Sorry, go ahead.
Given the sort of the specialism of my sort of research, I'd be very interested to understand, given the fact that many people have talked about change, transformation, change to the ways of working, etc., why do the panelists believe that the use of behavioural science is so poorly represented in many of these programs, when often than not, when we look at the different models and approaches towards change and transformation, are predicated around changing people's behaviours, and therefore underpinning that then is understanding the motivations, opportunities and capabilities to actually ignite, if you like, in a sense, the change that is necessary to deliver what we need to do to, how can I put it, reverse what we've been doing to the planet for the last 130 years or whatever it is.
I'm just vehemently nodding my agreement on that, because I couldn't, I'll jumped in, sorry. I've never found a professional way of saying this, but in my experience of working with manufacturers and sites, if someone gets it, they'll do it. You don't need a certification or regulation, or even they'll cope with shareholder pressure or anything else. They go, I want to run this in the best way possible and, I don't know, reduce my environmental impact and treat my workers well. They'll find ways to do it if they get it. And that's behaviour. And you can't, inspecting that in is really hard. And lots of people do get it, and then the pressures make it harder, but people will find stuff. Pre-Oxfam, I did a piece of work on appreciative inquiry as a change management process in a factory around empowerment and development of textile workers, because we recognise that if you're going from poor practices to good, that is a process of change. And it was enlightening. I found it amazing. And the factory really responded, and the client we were doing it for, but it just doesn't go anywhere. It sort of sat on a shelf somewhere, and that particular site got better and improved and stuff. So yeah, the more we could do that, and I'll happily come and talk to you and see in the work we do advising companies if we can bring it in, because I think it would be great to have more of it, personally.
I was thinking of the behavioral side from a consumer perspective. So how do you use, behavioral science to ensure that you're liaising in the best way, or you're getting across the message in a way that people are going to be receptive to it? And I think that organizations that ultimately want to influence their end user for good, to be able to change, like even if we think to the use of reusable water bottles, and how, historically the amount of plastic that was being used for water. How do you encourage proper, easy changes, and how do you target the audience and your end users to ultimately change the way in which they use? So, for example, how do you encourage end users who are going to buy a product like, let's say, an electric vehicle? How do you encourage them to charge their electric vehicle using renewable energy as opposed to using, coal-based energy? So I think it's an important aspect, and I think it would be interesting to see more of that used by organizations to be able to encourage their consumers in the best way possible.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. I mean, the nudge theory kind of gets a bit of a bad rep because of its political associations these days, but it can be extremely effective, even if it's just things like by 2025, the EU has mandated that member states have to have a separate textile waste collection. So just by making it available for people to have a separate bin for their textile waste, that will take a huge step forward in the ability to close the loop and turn textiles into a circular industry. And that's not forcing people to recycle textiles. That's just saying, here's a textile bin if you want to use it. We're going to pick it up from your door. And those are the kind of things that can make change.
I think I would agree with that as well. I think that one of the key issues here is better aligning our choices with our values. It's, you could be perfectly in agreement that plastic pollution, to take your example, Maureen, is terrible, and you be using less plastic, and it's all going to landfill, it's not being recycled. But then you go to the vending machine and you buy a fizzy drink in a plastic bottle, and you won't necessarily be able to explain to yourself why you've done that. Why it is that you can believe one thing but then act in a different way. On the kind of customer level, the B2C level, we kind of have to work through that and kind of align those two together, and then kind of apply it in all the different contexts of the B2B environment, with the regulation and the guidelines and frameworks that do exist in that environment, and try and think about it in that regard, because the challenge that we've had over the past 4 decades or more, and the reason I think that we're not making or haven't been making as much progress as we should is that people don't disagree that this is a problem. We all agree that this is a problem that needs solving. It's just that the actions that have been taken to date have not been aligned with that value, I think.
Okay, we could probably squeeze in one final question. If we get the microphone down to this gentleman in the front here. Tom? Just right in the centre, second row. And please try and keep it as brief as possible.
Sure thing. My name is Ed Packshaw. I'm Director of ESG Advisor at Revell. One of the things that we found particularly valuable about carbon footprinting and accounting is how businesses are able to scale their impact, what they're responsible for, how big it should be, or how little. So if you're an oil company, it's lots, and if you're a data agency, it's little. what's the measure for social? Perhaps there's one for you, Claire. What's the measure for social that will help businesses understand what they're responsible for and how much they should be putting back in?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm wondering if it's one for Liz, actually, as much as for me, in terms of what we'd look at. Because when you're trying to measure human dynamics, it's complicated. I'm going to think about that a second. Have a go while I think.
The quantification of social impact is a thorny issue, and not one that I'm going to attempt to solve on stage right now. I mean, beyond standard health and safety reporting for your own operations, I don't know, is the answer.
Social value and thing?
I mean, various people have attempted different things, and there's been attempts at how you can look at different impact on household level and put some kind of financial figure on that. And I've seen different modelling on that, and people that look at different externalities. I think you might want to, you can look at, I mean, obviously you can look at wages and level of income and household income and food baskets, and you can look at specific measures, and that's not undoable. Probably of more interest is how you get a measure where you're, coming back to us, is how you get a measure where you're hearing the voices of the people who are impacted, wherever that might be. And that becomes more complicated, but I think it could be doable. I mean, I think it is doable, and there are people beginning to do it. It's probably more than we've got time for now. I'm going to follow up with you on that one. Also, some of my much cleverer colleagues than I at Oxfam could definitely give some coherent answers on this. We've just hired a new impact investing director at Oxfam GB, so I think we can certainly, because it's taking what we know and that impact measuring and going, how do you look at that if you're an investor or a shareholder or something else, and measure that social value in one coherent way is, I get the question. And there's different bits to the answer.
Okay, Claire is right. That is all we've got time for, unfortunately. But please do carry on this conversation in the networking areas later on, or please do reach out to the speakers via the event app as well. But for now, please show your appreciation for our panel, which is Liz, Sam, Maureen and Claire. Thank you, everybody.